Good to see each of you in worship this morning. Singing about our God who is love. First Sunday of every month this year, we are taking some passage from the Gospel of Luke, focusing on that chapter and asking ourselves, what is it that God wants to teach us? What is it that Jesus wants to teach us from this particular passage? I have in my hand a bird. I have in my hand a bird that was made out of a dollar bill by Matt Sears. You may not know it, but Matt is a professional at turning dollars into something that they're not. And I asked him to make me a bird out of this dollar to illustrate the point that I think you and I have learned probably by personal experience, that money flies, doesn't it? And it seems like the smaller the bill is, the faster it goes. I know I can carry a 20 in my wallet for 4 or 5 days, but once it gets broken, it seems to fly out of the wallet a whole lot faster than that 20 does. Don't you wish that you could have back all of the money that you've wasted over the years? Some of us who may be relatively close to retirement may have already been able to retire. We had all the dollar bills that flew out of our hand for senseless, pointless purposes if we could just have them back. But it seems like money just flies away. It's a whole lot harder to earn it than it is to spend it, isn't it? You ever ask yourself where a dollar goes? If you could trace the path of $1 bill from the time it leaves a printer with the Federal Reserve until it gets into your hand, it would be interesting to know where that dollar went. I don't know if it would be possible to do that. But let me introduce you to Dean Brady, who did something similar. He's an artist. And as you know, artists just kind of ride a horse with a different color. He was at an art exhibit in Seattle, Washington, back in the late 1990s. And he saw this big mosaic. And he got the idea of himself making a mosaic with postcards from all over the world. And so here was his idea. He borrowed $10,000 from a friend of his, quit his job, that's an artist for you, quit his job, and spent, I believe it is, 9 weeks, 10 hours a day, writing on the back of each one of those $1 bills, send me a postcard. DDB, gave his address in Missouri, and he wrote, "Have a nice day." He was living in Arizona at the time. He went to Missouri, to his hometown, and he opened up a bank account, deposited those $1,000 bills into the bank account, and then sat back and waited. Nothing came for a long time. But then starting in May of 2001, he started getting postcards. And he started getting letters. A few people even mailed the dollar back to him. He got letters from Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, the Middle East. He was featured in an issue of the Reader's Digest sometime in 2001, I believe. He did have a website, wheredoesadollargo.com, but I checked on it and apparently it's not up anymore. He wanted to publish a book. I haven't checked to see if the book's published. But he wanted to make a mosaic 16 by 20 feet And so he estimated he needed about 4,000 postcards to do this. And the last figure that I saw was 6,500 postcards from literally all over the world. And the book that he was wanting to write would include some of the stories that people sent him. People who were down on their luck, and that dollar bill coming to them, picked them up, cheered them up. Some of them wrote sad stories to him. Some of them told him where the dollar bill that they had in their possession had gone while it was in their possession. Where does a dollar bill go? I want us to study Luke chapter 16 this morning. Turning your Bibles to Luke chapter 16. If you're using the Bible in the pew, that is page 875. Let us see a story here, a parable here, that Jesus uses to teach us how important it is to use money wisely. Now, when we pick up with verse 1 of chapter 16, we really don't know what's going on. All Luke writes is that he was also saying to his disciples. So we need to back up to see what is the context in which Jesus is speaking. And that takes us all the way back to chapter 15, verse 1. And we look at chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, and we see where Jesus was eating with tax collectors and sinners. And the Pharisees were grumbling with him about him because this man receives sinners and eats with them. But then if you notice in chapter 16, drop down to, say, verse 14, which is after Jesus gives us the parable. The Pharisees, notice, who were lovers of money, were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him. So Jesus was eating with tax collectors and sinners. He was eating with poor people. He gives his disciples this parable that we're going to study this morning. And then the Pharisees make fun of him. And Luke tells us the reason why they make fun of him is because they love money. Who was it that said a few years ago, whoever said money may not buy happiness has never had money? The Pharisees were like that. Lovers of money. Let's look at this parable, first of all. Verses 1 and 2. Jesus says to his disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager. He was a steward of his possessions. And this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be managed. Now there are some jobs, obviously, in which it is easy to squander money. It's easy to siphon money off the top. A missionary, for example. It's easy for a missionary who is dishonest to report one thing to Christians in the United States and to spend the money in a totally different way. If you're a person who is in control of other people's money, depending on how tightly your boss regulates your books, it's quite easy to be dishonest. This man was dishonest. It was reported to his boss and he squandered. If you look back at chapter 15 and verse 13, this is the same word that's translated prodigal in the story of the prodigal son. He squandered his estate with loose living, the prodigal son did. Well, this man is in charge of somebody else's. The prodigal son wasted his own money. And that's one thing. This man in our parable today is squandering somebody else's money. And the boss gets wind of it. And he says, I want you to show me where everything went, and then you're out the door. So that's the situation that this steward finds himself in. But then he sits down and he makes a plan. Beginning in verse 3, Jesus tells us, the manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? Number one, I am not strong enough to dig. I don't know what he means by that. Maybe he's got some laziness in him. Maybe he's a weak person, physically. He says, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. Well, I think that's rather ironic, isn't it? He wasn't ashamed to lie on his books. He wasn't ashamed to steal his boss's money, but he is ashamed to beg. So I can't dig and I can't beg. Notice what he says, verse 4. I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. Now, as we go through the end of the parable, that verse 4 right there is going to be a key to understanding what the parable is about. So he lays out this plan here. And Jesus tells us what the plan is. Notice, first of all, verse 7. The manager summoned each one of his master's debtors, and he began saying to the first, how much do you owe my master? And the first one said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. 100 measures of oil is around 800 gallons of olive oil. Now that is the produce, my understanding, of around 150 olive trees. Josephus, who lived at the time of Jesus, the Apostle Paul says it was 147 olive trees to be exact. That's 1,000 denarii worth of income. A denarius is 1 day's salary. So you're looking at nearly 3 years' worth of income. This individual is not poor. But the manager says, let's tear up the old accounting ledger and let's make a new agreement. And I'll reduce what you owe by 50%. It's quite a reduction, isn't it? What if your bank wrote you a letter and said, you know what, you've been a good customer over these last 10 years. We're going to take your mortgage and we're going to cut it in half. Worked very nice, wouldn't it? And maybe the bank that owns your car loan. This man cut his debt by 50%. Well, then he has another customer here. And these are just illustrations of the kind of people that owed money. Verse 7, he said to this other one, how much do you owe? He said, I owe 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill and write 80. Well, that's a good bit of wheat too. That's over 1,000 bushels worth of wheat, which is about 2,500 denarii, 2,500 days' salary. About 100 acres worth of wheat. And he gives him a 20% reduction on that. Let's tear up the old ledger. Let's write us a new agreement, and you pay that much. Now, to be honest, we do not know what is going on here. It may be that what he is doing is taking out his own commission. His commission, in other words, may have been the 50% or the 20% that he takes away and says, okay, you just owe what you owe my boss, and I will not take my commission. That's one suggestion. Another suggestion is this 50% and 20% may have been interest that was being charged. Now, if it was interest being charged, it was illegal under the law of Moses to charge fellow Israelites interest. The boss may have not known about it. This may have simply been the manager doing that and charging him interest. Or the third option is, he may be deceitful once again. If the manager doesn't know what the books say, he simply tells the customer, the client, you just give me 50% of what you owe, we'll call it even. So he may have been stealing, in a sense, once again from his boss. One of those three options, either one of them could be legitimate, we don't know. But what is he doing? He's getting into the good graces of people who could give him a job now once his boss fires him. That's what he said in verse 4. Notice again back up in verse 4. I know what I shall do so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. What he's doing is he's getting on the good graces